Throughout this series, we've been talking a lot about nickel because, well, there's a lot to talk about. But that wouldn't be the case if it weren't for EVs. Sorry, stainless steel, you're great and all, but it's EVs' time to shine. The global push for EVs has made nickel one of the most important, aka critical metals in the world, which also makes it a huge opportunity. By 2030, it's projected that over half of all new vehicles sold will be electric, and it'll just go up from there. In fact, over that same 8-year period, the EV market is expected to quadruple to nearly $1 trillion USD. Again, that's just the start. I sat down with my first guest, Emma Jarrett, the managing editor of Electric Autonomy Canada, to talk about the world of EVs. Here's a little of that conversation. Thanks again for joining us, Emma. I wanted to start by asking you for a 1,000-foot view of the EV world right now, because when I look at all the different pieces and see the amount of change, money, opportunity, risk, and chaos, the whole thing seems dizzying. I mean, they call it a revolution, right? So there's clearly a lot of action and a whole lot at stake.
There absolutely is. What I would say is that it's a very dynamic space right now, and foreseeably for the next decade at least. Every day there is something different, new, exciting happening. There's tons of public financing that is going into trying to make this transition successful and equitable, ideally. So I think that where the seeming chaos comes from is on the innovation side. And happily, it's not chaos. It's very organized movement, but there's so much innovation happening in so many different sectors that all feed into this one goal of making our transportation sector zero emission.
When you talk EV innovation, I immediately think of vehicle range. I know this has been a common knock against EVs, but it's clearly getting better. So what are your thoughts on where the tech is today and the importance people seem to put on range?
Well, again, that's a funny psychological barrier that some of the public has built up in their minds. Do you expect to be able to drive without ever stopping at a gas station in your gas car, driving from Vancouver to Edmonton?
No.
I don't. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah,
so,
right.
I mean, it's one of those things where our expectation of the new technology so greatly exceeds A, what our needs actually are, but B, what even our internal combustion vehicles are performing for us today. But I think where people get stuck on range is the uncertainty about charging infrastructure.
Right.
And will they have access to it is the first question. How do I know where the chargers are? And happily, public charging networks are building out. There is a real appreciation of this need. I mean, we spent 100 years building out gas station infrastructure, and, hopefully the infrastructure needed for charging stations will not take 100 years, and it will be on par in terms of availability with gas stations much sooner than that.
Your point about infrastructure is an important one. If people have the established support they need to make the switch, it makes sense that they'd probably be less inclined to find issues like range. And with less hesitation, these people can feel free to get on board, which is exactly what they should do. I mean, ultimately, the EV revolution is about saving the planet, is it not?
I wish that EVs could save the planet. That would be very nice and neat and tidy. They aren't the silver bullet, unfortunately, but they will help be a really important part of the solution. By electrifying transportation and pivoting completely our energy generation to zero emission or renewables, you're looking at slicing off 30% of our national GHG emissions, which is a pretty significant slice of the pie. That is, the environmental case.
Well said. Now let's switch gears for a moment and look at this EV decision through a sustainability lens. What do you say to someone who's making a decision between gas or electric when it comes to carbon footprint? What does the cradle-to-grave story look like when comparing these two options?
Well, it starts underground, I guess, like a gas car. It just goes in a slightly different order. So, we all know that the life cycle of a gas car is the parts are made in a factory, the car is assembled and driven off the lot by its owner, and then it spends its life however long it's in use, which could be between 10 to 15 plus years if it's very well taken care of, spewing emissions from burning gas. And then the car ends up being, hopefully, recycled, which is pretty good for the metal recovery off the body of the car. I think last I heard that was about like 87% recovery is able to happen if a car is recycled, or an ICE car is able to be recycled. On the electric side, the car starts underground, like I said. The battery minerals have to be collected, refined, turned into a battery as we know it today, which is a very long process that I don't have to bog you down with. But long story short, the battery has to be made before it can go into the car. And then that car spends its life not emitting anything. And at the end of it, the car, for however long it lasts, between 10 to hopefully 15 years, the car will be recycled, both the vehicle body, which is on par with how well a gas car can be recycled at about 87%. And then the battery gets recycled, which is at an even better recovery rate of about 95%. The reason I said both cars start underground is that the fuel for the gas car comes from the ground, as we know, like that's where we get oil from. And I think people underestimate how much we don't see of how the gas we pump into our cars is created. We have to dig down. It has to be pulled up. It has to be refined and piped and shipped to, distribution centers, then trucked to the gas stations to be put back into the reservoirs underneath, then to just be pumped out of, the nozzle into someone's vehicle. And you can see that the footprint of that vehicle is going to be significantly greater than a battery one.
What you're saying makes perfect sense, and it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. So let me ask you this. Why do so many people struggle with making this switch to electric? Why is there so much resistance and unfounded criticism when we know this is the right thing to do?
I think that people who have concerns about switching to an electric vehicle, it's just human nature. Most of our concerns are fueled by fear, and often fear of the unknown. And so this unknown grows in their mind. I'm expected to just, trade in this car that I've had for 5 or 7 years that works for me, that I can depend on, that I have confidence in, their gas vehicle, and go with this totally unknown car that I've never even clapped eyes on or don't know anybody else that's clapped eyes on it. It feels very jarring, I think. We all like comfort. We all like the familiar and what we know and our routines. But I would just say to those people who have those fears of a technology that they're unfamiliar with, did you feel that way about phones? Like, do you make all your business calls or all your calls for your life off a rotary phone that's bolted to your kitchen wall? Or do you have a cell phone in your pocket? And if you have a cell phone in your pocket, tell me about the process of buying it. Did you do a lot of research on it? Did you want to find the model that's the lightest and, the fastest performance and has the best, camera on it, the best bells and whistles? And then when you actually went to purchase it, did you get to go to the store to hold it in your hand and look at it and, sort of try out the features before you pulled out your credit card to buy it and go home with it? And I think that it's that interactive part of the purchase experience that really, at least in my case, like if I can just speak about my experience, that really put paid to any question marks I had in my mind. It was that weekend that I finally got to sit in this electric car and went like, oh, all the things that I thought would be hard for me are not hard at all. And there's tons of benefits that I didn't anticipate when I was imagining driving around in this thing.
It's interesting. We can all see and accept the importance of EVs, yet many of us still resist them to a degree. As Emma says, it's human nature to resist change, so maybe it makes sense because this is change on a scale that we'll rarely see in our lifetimes. The entire global automobile industry is getting flipped on its head, and everyone, from the largest manufacturers to the little old end users, have to find their way through it. There is no alternative. This is happening because it needs to for the future of our planet. So let's make sure it happens right. There is so much money and opportunity at hand here, which means there is also incredible incentive to innovate and compete. This can be a great thing, but also a scary one. As we discussed previously, we can't be conflicted or compromised in our pursuit of electrification, because ultimately the stakes are too important. I spoke with my next guest about all the activity and excitement happening in the EV space and the role of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, in helping keep us on track. Here's some of that conversation with Mr. Philip Couillard, chair of the Canadian division of Britishvolt, the leading UK-based battery cell manufacturer. Okay, so I was reading an article the other day, Mr. Couillard, that said there has been something like 1.3 million patents, roughly, since 2017 in the lithium-ion battery space. That is a lot of patents. I'm just wondering, what's that world like right now? Is it really kind of exploding and on fire?
Well, patents have started accumulating for a long time. As you know, we've been talking about these batteries for many, many years, and it's accelerating right now, as you said, rightly so. Because, for example, new chemistries are coming forward. The solid-state format is pointing its nose at the door. So all these things are happening at the same time at an accelerated pace. But this being said, this is why you need to be constantly innovating in this industry. It's not something where you decide to put a product on the market and it will be the same for the next 5 years. Most people will have a hard time telling you what the dominant chemistry will be 5-10 years from now, even less than that.
Oh, really? Even less than that is a possibility, eh?
Yes.
Yeah.
For example, look at what's going on now. For those familiar with the battery industry, the dominant chemistry until recently, and still is, by the way, it's called NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt. And this is the power type of battery that we see in cars like Teslas and Porsches and all these new EVs that we see all over the place. But an old chemistry called LFP, which is lithium iron phosphate, is coming back because it has its own advantages in terms of cost, durability, safety, etc. So sometimes the history reinvents itself. It's not the first time we see this. Huh?
Mm-hmm, yeah, no. Speaking of advantages, and right now what we're working with, what are the advantages of using nickel in batteries?
Well, this is one of the best minerals to store energy. And when we say store energy, what do we need? The capacity to retain lithium ions, but retain them just enough so they can go the other side of the battery when you recharge. Because as you know, a lithium-ion battery is like a seesaw system where your ions will go from one side to the other, from the cathode to the anode and vice versa, whether you're charging or discharging the battery. So you need a composite that's going to hold the ions at the right place, but not too hard, not too strongly, because you want them to be able to move away to the other side. And while the ions move, the electrons move in a separate circuit. This is what makes your electric motor work, for example, in your EV or in whatever you use with electricity.
All of this seems super interesting, but I have to say, the more I read and learn about nickel and EVs, the more industry jargon I come across. Can I ask you to help clarify a couple of things, like what is a battery ecosystem?
All right, what is an ecosystem? The Earth is an ecosystem. It's a system where all components are linked with one another in some way. So when you talk about an ecosystem for batteries, you need a system of organizations, businesses, institutions that are going to be coordinating their actions from the moment you mine the mineral out of the earth until you put it in a battery, and then finally you put the battery in an EV, an electric vehicle. That's called an ecosystem. And the more you control this ecosystem, as far as countries are concerned, the better for you, because you have a strategic location in this value chain.
Okay, Giga plants. Why are they called Giga plants?
Because the way we measure the output of a battery manufacturing facility is not the number of batteries. Strangely, it's not the number of batteries that are produced. It's the energy that is produced in form of batteries. So when you talk about gigawatts, watts, kilowatts, megawatts, you go back to your high school books and you'll find this again. But it means this is the energy contained in all the batteries that this factory is turning out, let's say, during a year. That's why we use this terminology. I think Elon Musk is the first one that used the term Giga plant years ago. If I'm not mistaken, I may be mistaken, and some of your listeners may correct me, but I believe he was the first one to use this terminology.
No, I think you're right. Now, I saw that you recently participated in the Critical Minerals and Batteries Conference. What were some of the big themes or takeaways from that conversation as it relates to nickel, etc.?
Well, it wasn't only about nickel. The conversation was also about how Canada can be an important player in the battery industry, and what British Volt, the company I work with, brings to the table. So the way I define this company is, first, it's an innovative, technology-driven company that is based out of the UK ecosystem. Here we are again with the word ecosystem. And one of the best and the first ones was created in the UK. Actually, UK, England, Oxford University is where the lithium-ion battery was invented. And a Nobel Prize was given to the Oxford scientists at that time. And since then, it wasn't that much commercialized in the country that invented it, which is, by the way, something we see once in a while. It went away. It went to Asia. But now people are trying to bring it back to Europe, back to the UK, back to USA, back to Canada. So the supply chain is more evenly distributed in the planet. So that we were talking about this advantage that British Volt brings because of its history of being in the center of one of the best ecosystems in the world around the lithium-ion batteries. A company with also significant manufacturing expertise and a quite deep, what we call ESG, these three letters that you see everywhere, environment, social, governance concepts, a deep ESG commitment and a measurable commitment. And that's what the company is. And that's why we are pushing this advantage, not only in terms of the expertise on how to make batteries, but in what context you make batteries, how much carbon. This is now, we're in the days of COP26 in Glasgow. So how much carbon do you use when you make a lithium-ion battery? That's going to be a significant issue in the coming years. So people are going to be differentiating themselves on many, many criteria. One of them will be, what is your carbon footprint? That's the new way of saying it. And of course, you want this footprint to be as low as possible. And you want to be able to measure it. It's easy for me to tell you we're going to manufacture the greenest battery, but I should be able to prove it to you by showing you the numbers. And this is what we're doing at British Volt. We are engaging a company that is going to measure continuously what we do in terms of carbon footprint.
It seems that the more conversations I have about nickel and batteries, the more I hear those three letters. Clearly, ESG has an important role to play.
The three letters, environment, we just talked about carbon and greenhouse gas and climate change. Social, what is the impact of this company in its community? For example, British Volt has founded a foundation in northeastern New England, which is there to give access to young people there to the new jobs brought about by this industrial revolution that EV and the batteries represent. And G is governance. Do you have a good representation of society in your board of directors, in your company, in terms of gender, in terms of origins, et cetera, et cetera? So these three letters, ESG, this is what it's all about. The connection between the company and the community it's operating into. And also it's becoming, before, it was, Eric, it was something nice to have that you would quote in a conversation. It would look good. But now it's something you must have because people want to be able, again, to measure what you say and not let you get a free ticket on saying whatever you want about how green you are and how low carbon you are.
Yeah, accountability and also the role of investors, kind of as an investor in something like this, it really, you really got to do your research and look into things like that. So it's
if you want to say that you're investing in a green revolution and the green energy transition, then again, you want to make sure that the money you're investing is going to participate in the improvement of the environment and not something else. So you need to tell your colleagues investing with you that this company we're investing in is deeply preoccupied with the ESG component of what it does and is able to measure it and be accountable for it. And this is what counts more and more. This is something when you met investors that you never discussed, basically. You only discuss the product, the technology, the market, prices. But now, one of the first questions you're being asked by investors and society in general is, what type of an impact do you make on society? Not only because of the batteries you make or the product you make and sell, but also the way you do it, again, as I was saying earlier, in terms of your commitment to the environment, to society, and to a balanced governance in the company.
It's reassuring, the idea that sustainability and environment have become a priority in the investment world. Hasn't always been the case, I'm sure. On that sustainability topic, I want to ask you one last question. There is only so much that we can mine, so the question begs, how much can we recover from what we use? A previous guest mentioned up to 95%. Are batteries really that recyclable?
they are pretty recyclable. That's good news, by the way, because if you look at you've seen the numbers that are predicted for the next 10, 15, 20 years. At some point, there will be no more nickel and lithium to mine. There will be huge quantities, but it's not infinite. So it's obvious that we do need to recycle as much as possible. The good news is it's technically possible now. There are a few companies coming forward that do a very good job of recuperating the battery of your EV, which now is a big square basis of your car made of metals, plastics, connectors, everything. So you recuperate all of this. Plus, you take the minerals. And you make, again, new minerals with them, the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel, and you put it back in the recipe to make new batteries. It's kind of a circular economy, if you see what I mean, coming back to the origin always. This is also something that's critically important. It's a very good question to ask to any battery manufacturer.
Mr. Couillard, thank you for your time. This was a wonderful chat and very informative, exactly what I was looking for.
It's been a pleasure, Eric, and I wish you all the best as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
And to your listeners.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks
bye-bye.
so much. Bye-bye. Okay, so what did we learn here? Overall, I'd say the main takeaway is pretty clear. EVs are awesome. Yes, there are some trade-offs and limitations, but the amount of investment and innovation that's happening in this space right now is starting to pay off big time, as battery tech just keeps getting better and better. And while there is a reliance on critical metals that are not infinite in their supply, like nickel, the high recyclability and circular economy of the tech helps offset those concerns. Ultimately, there is no winning argument against EVs, just some expected resistance that comes with change. We know this is the right thing to do, which is why it's happening across the world, and why ESG has become such an important piece in keeping us on the straight and narrow as we attempt to save our planet. And while EVs may not be the silver bullet solution, they're pretty close. Electrifying transportation can cut GHGs by 30%, which is massive. And that's before we consider the human benefits for going electric or other potential battery applications, like powering homes or businesses. We're just at the beginning of this revolution, and in our next episode, we'll have a look at the future with a spotlight on where battery tech is going and what it could mean for EVs and beyond. Thanks for listening to the Charge Podcast. Make sure you catch our next episode by subscribing or following our show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more info, visit thechargepodcast.com or follow us on LinkedIn and at @the_charge_pod on Twitter. And if you feel so inclined, please leave us a review at Apple Podcasts. We'd love to hear from our listeners. The Charge is a Giga Metals podcast produced by Podium Podcast Company.